Captain Thaddeus Kane walked the storm-battered shore of Devil's Cay, his weathered boots crunching through broken shells and seaweed. The hurricane had passed 3 days ago, leaving behind the usual debris, driftwood, torn sails, and the occasional treasure washed up from some unlucky ship. His crew combed the beach nearby, searching for anything of value. That's when Kane spotted it, a massive sea turtle, easily 3 feet across, lying helplessly on its back in the sand. Poor creature had been tossed ashore by the storm and couldn't right itself. Kane had always respected sea turtles. Sailors considered them good luck. He knelt beside the ancient reptile, placed his hands on its weathered shell, and gently flipped it over. What he saw underneath made his blood freeze. Carved deep into the turtle's plastron were symbols he recognized from nightmares. But what terrifying curse had he just unleashed upon his crew? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The brass compass in Thaddeus Kane's weathered hand trembled like a dying bird. 3 generations of his family had trusted this instrument to guide them across treacherous waters. Yet now its needle spun wildly, refusing to find true north. Kane tapped the glass face with a scarred finger, muttering a curse under his breath. Nothing. The damned thing had worked perfectly until he'd touched that turtle. The widow's revenge creaked gently at anchor in the protected cove of Devil's Cay, her black hull scarred by countless battles and storms. She was a sleek brigantine, built for speed rather than cargo capacity, perfect for the kind of work that had kept Kane and his crew fed for the past 15 years. 43 souls called her home, though that number had dwindled from the 67 who'd signed aboard when Kane first took command. Captain called Willem Drexel, his graying first mate, as he approached across the sandy beach. The lads are getting restless about that turtle business. Finn McReady's been telling tales about cursed creatures and ill omens. Got half the crew spooked. Kane studied his compass once more, watching the needle dance between directions like a man possessed. His father had carried this instrument through the War of Spanish Succession, and his grandfather before that had navigated by it during raids against Dutch merchants in the Caribbean. It had never failed the Kane family until today. Finn McReady's been sailing these waters for 20 years, Kane replied, snapping the compass shut. If he's spooked, maybe the rest of us should listen. Drexel raised an eyebrow. In all their years together, he'd never heard Kane give credence to superstition. The captain was known throughout the Caribbean as a practical man who trusted steel, gunpowder, and wind more than luck or legend. Pirates from Port Royal to Tortuga told stories of Thaddeus Kane's calculated raids, his precise navigation, and his ability to read weather patterns like scripture. You don't seriously believe that Turtle was anything more than a storm casualty, Drexel said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. Kane looked back toward the spot where they'd found the creature. The turtle had disappeared shortly after he'd flipped it upright, crawling toward the surf with surprising speed for something so ancient and weathered. But the image of those symbols carved into its underside remained burned into his memory, intricate patterns that seemed familiar yet impossible to place. I've sailed these waters since I was 16, Kane said slowly, seen storms that could crack a mountain and calms that lasted for weeks. I've witnessed waterspouts, rogue waves, and phenomena that would make learned men question their sanity. But I've never seen anything like those markings. The crew of the Widow's Revenge was a collection of hard men drawn from ports across the Caribbean and beyond. There was Johannes Schmidt, a former Prussian naval officer who'd turned pirate after a court-martial ruined his career. Miguel Santos brought his knowledge of Spanish shipping routes and an ability to speak 4 languages fluently. Young Tommy Hartwell, barely 19, served as their powder monkey and possessed an uncanny talent for predicting weather changes. Most of the crew had been with Kane for years, bound together by shared dangers and the promise of equal shares in whatever treasure they claimed. They trusted their captain's judgment because he'd kept them alive and relatively prosperous in a profession where most men died young and poor. But trust could evaporate quickly when superstition took hold. Kane watched his men working along the shoreline, gathering driftwood for repairs and searching for anything the storm might have deposited. Their movements seemed less confident now, their voices quieter. Several times he'd caught crew members glancing nervously toward the spot where the turtle had been found, making subtle signs against evil that sailors had used for centuries. "What do you make of this?" Drexel asked, producing a small object from his coat pocket. Kane took the item and examined it carefully. It was a piece of coral, but unlike any he'd seen before. The surface was covered in the same intricate symbols that had been carved into the turtle's shell, and it felt unnaturally warm to the touch, despite having been underwater for who knew how long. "Where did you find this?" "Washed up about 50 yards from where you found that turtle. There are more of them scattered along the high tide line." Kane pocketed the coral fragment and looked out toward the horizon. The afternoon sun painted the Caribbean waters in shades of gold and turquoise, beautiful and deceptively peaceful. Somewhere out there, other crews were searching for Spanish treasure ships or planning raids on merchant vessels. It was honest work, if piracy could ever be called honest. But something had changed when he'd touched that turtle. The compass knew it, his crew sensed it, and deep in his bones Kane felt it too. The scream that pierced the morning air sent every man on the beach running toward its source. Kane found young Tommy Hartwell kneeling beside the turtle's resting place, his face pale as sailcloth, staring at something glinting in the sand. "What is it, lad?" Kane demanded, pushing through the gathering crowd of pirates. Tommy pointed with a trembling finger at a cavity in the sand where the turtle had lain. Nestled within were 13 Spanish doubloons, each one gleaming as if freshly minted, despite the obvious age of their design. But it wasn't their golden luster that had frightened the boy. It was the dark stains covering each coin and the familiar symbols etched into their surfaces. Kane knelt and carefully lifted one of the coins. The metal felt warm, almost alive, and the dark staining looked disturbingly like dried blood. Fresh blood, despite the impossibility of it. The symbols matched those carved into the turtle's shell, exactly. Intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. "Mother of God," whispered Finn Macready, crossing himself. "Those are Blackheart's coins." The name sent a chill through the assembled crew. Every pirate in the Caribbean knew the legend of Captain Mordecai Blackheart, though most considered it nothing more than a cautionary tale told in taverns to frighten green sailors. According to the stories, Blackheart had discovered a treasure so vast it could buy entire kingdoms, but something had gone wrong during his final voyage. His ship, the Damnation's Pride, had been found drifting empty near these very waters 3 decades ago. Her crew vanished without a trace. "Blackheart's just a story," Kane said, though his voice lacked conviction. "A legend sailors used to explain ships that disappear in storms." Miguel Santos, their Spanish interpreter, stepped forward to examine the coins more closely. His dark eyes widened as he read the inscriptions around the edges. "These aren't just Spanish gold, Capitan," he said quietly. "Look at the markings. This is ritual gold, coins blessed by priests and marked with protective symbols. But something has corrupted them. The blood, it's part of some ceremony." Kane studied the other coins, each one identical in its dark staining and mysterious warmth. 13 coins for 13 crew members, perhaps. Or 13 sacrifices. The thought made his stomach turn. "We should throw them back in the sea," said Johannes Schmidt, his Prussian accent thick with concern. "Gold cursed by blood brings nothing but death." "Cursed gold spends the same as any other," countered Black Pete Morrison, reaching for one of the coins. "I've never seen metal this pure." "Don't touch them," Kane snapped, causing Pete to freeze mid-reach. "Not until we understand what we're dealing with." But it was too late for such precautions. The moment Kane had lifted the first coin, something had stirred in the depths of the Caribbean. That night, as the crew slept aboard the Widow's Revenge, the dreams began. Every man experienced the same vision, a massive ship sailing through waters black as ink, her crew chanting in languages that predated human civilization. At the ship's helm stood Captain Mordecai Blackheart himself, his face a mask of madness and desperation, as he performed some unspeakable ritual involving 13 sacred turtles. Kane jolted awake as the vision reached its climax, his body drenched in sweat despite the cool sea breeze. Around him, other crew members were stirring restlessly, muttering in their sleep or crying out from nightmares. The shared experience was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Willem Drexel appeared at his hammock, looking haggard and shaken. "Captain, we need to talk. The whole crew's been having the same dream about Blackheart and those turtles." "This isn't natural." Kane sat up, running his hands through his graying hair. In the moonlight filtering through the ship's windows, he could see the pouch containing the 13 coins where he'd secured them in his sea chest. Even through the leather, they seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "What exactly did you see in your dream?" Kane asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Blackheart performing some kind of ritual. 13 turtles arranged in a circle, each one carved with symbols like the ones we found. He was trying to bind something that didn't want to be bound. And when the ritual went wrong," Drexel shuddered, unable to finish the sentence. Kane made his decision. Tomorrow they would begin searching for answers about Captain Blackheart's lost treasure. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings about pursuing cursed gold, but something deeper, something touched by the supernatural compelled him forward. The hunt had already begun, whether he wanted it or not. The old Portuguese trader's shop in Port Royal reeked of mildew, rum, and secrets. Joaquin Vasco had been collecting maritime artifacts for 40 years, and his cramped establishment held more nautical history than most museums. When Kane described the symbols from the turtle and coins, the weathered merchant's eyes lit up with recognition and fear. "You should not have come here asking about Blackheart," Vasco whispered, glancing nervously toward his shop's entrance. "Some knowledge is too dangerous to possess." But Kane's purse spoke louder than the merchant's caution. For 50 pieces of silver, Vasco disappeared into his back room and returned with a water-stained leather portfolio tied with rotting rope. "These pages were found floating near the Windward Passage 30 years ago," Vasco explained, his hands shaking as he untied the binding. "Part of Blackheart's logbook, written in his own hand during his final voyage." The parchment was brittle and brown with age, covered in spidery handwriting that seemed to crawl across the page in the flickering candlelight. Kane squinted at the faded ink, making out fragments of entries that chilled him to the bone. Day 47. The turtle guardians grow restless. The binding weakens with each dawn. God forgive me for what I have unleashed upon these waters. Day 52. Lost 3 more men to the dreams. They walk into the sea calling names in languages older than Christ. The 13 grow strong. Day 58. I understand now why the Arawak called this place the Devil's Garden. We are not treasure hunters. We are prisoners in a game played by forces beyond mortal comprehension. Willem Drexel read over Kane's shoulder, his breathing growing shallow as they progressed through the torn pages. The final entry was barely legible, written in what appeared to be blood rather than ink. "The ritual cannot be completed. The demon grows too strong, and I lack the will to make the final sacrifice. I have hidden the 13th guardian where none will find it. May God have mercy on whoever disturbs its rest, for they will face what I could not destroy." Kane closed the portfolio carefully, his mind racing. The turtle they'd found wasn't just any creature. It was the 13th guardian Blackheart had written about, hidden for 3 decades, until the hurricane had exposed its resting place. "There's more," Vasco said reluctantly. "Stories the old fishermen tell when they've had too much rum. They speak of 13 sacred turtles that once protected these waters from something ancient and hungry. A sea demon that fed on ships and souls until the Arawak shamans bound it using the turtles as spiritual anchors. And Blackheart found these turtles. Kane found them and tried to use them for his own purposes. He thought he could control the demon, make it serve his greed. Instead, he awakened something that should have remained sleeping. That evening, aboard the Widow's Revenge, Kane gathered his senior crew to share what he'd learned. The men listened in increasingly uncomfortable silence as he read passages from Blackheart's logbook by lamplight in his cabin. "So we're dealing with some kind of sea demon?" asked Johannes Schmidt, his Germanic practicality warring with growing supernatural dread. "According to these writings, yes, something called the Leviathan, bound by 13 sacred turtles and guarded by whoever possesses them." Miguel Santos crossed himself and muttered a prayer in Spanish. "My grandmother used to tell stories about creatures like this, ancient things that lived in the deep places before man learned to sail. They hunger for more than gold. They consume souls." "Superstitious nonsense," declared Black Pete Morrison, though his bravado sounded forced. "Dead pirates and sea demons make for good tavern tales, but I've never seen a ghost that could spend coin, or a demon that could stop a cannonball." As if summoned by Pete's skepticism, a commotion erupted on deck. The crew rushed topside to find Seamus O'Grady, their Irish bosun, standing at the rail in his nightclothes. His eyes were wide and unseeing, and he was speaking in a voice not his own. The 13 guardians called to their master, O'Grady intoned in an accent that belonged to no earthly nation. "The binding weakens. Soon the deep waters will reclaim what was stolen from them." Kane grabbed O'Grady by the shoulders and shook him roughly. "Seamus, wake up, man." The bosun blinked several times, then looked around in confusion. "Captain, what am I doing on deck? Last I remember, I was in my hammock having the strangest dream about swimming through underwater caves." Kane exchanged worried glances with Drexel. O'Grady's possessed speech had been witnessed by the entire crew, making it impossible to dismiss as imagination or coincidence. The hidden cove revealed itself only at low tide, when the receding waters exposed a narrow channel between jagged coral formations. Kane guided the Widow's Revenge through the treacherous passage with the skill of a man who had spent 30 years reading the Caribbean's moods and secrets. There, nestled against the cliff face like a sleeping giant, lay the skeletal remains of the Damnation's Pride. Blackheart's flagship had been magnificent once, a 3-masted galleon built for both speed and intimidation. Now she sat half-submerged and broken, her hull split by decades of storms and the relentless hunger of the sea. Barnacles and coral had claimed her lower sections, transforming the once-feared pirate vessel into an artificial reef. "Sweet Jesus," breathed Willem Drexel. "She's been here all along." Kane studied the wreck through his spyglass, noting the unnatural preservation of her upper structures. Most ships abandoned to the elements for 30 years would have been reduced to scattered timbers by now. Yet the Damnation's Pride retained her basic shape, as if some force were preventing her complete destruction. "Lower the boats," Kane commanded. "We're going aboard." The boarding party consisted of Kane, Drexel, Miguel Santos, and 4 of their most trusted men. As they rowed toward the wreck, the water around them began to change color, shifting from crystal blue to an unsettling greenish-black that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. The climb aboard proved treacherous. The ship's rail, once polished to a mirror shine, was now encrusted with strange growths that cut like razors and bled a luminescent fluid when disturbed. Kane's boots slipped on the deck planking, which had taken on a spongy texture that felt disturbingly organic. "Captain," called Tommy Hartwell from near the main mast. "You need to see this." The young sailor stood beside what had once been the ship's wheel, now fused with coral and seaweed into a grotesque sculpture. But it was the object clutched in the skeletal remains of hands still gripping the wheel that captured Kane's attention. The bone sextant was a masterwork of scrimshaw artistry, carved from what appeared to be whalebone and inlaid with symbols that matched those from the turtle and coins. Unlike normal sextants designed to sight celestial bodies, this instrument seemed to be pointing towards something beneath the waves. Kane carefully pried the artifact from the skeleton's grasp, noting how the bones crumbled to powder at his touch. The moment his fingers closed around the sextant, images flooded his mind, visions of underwater caverns where massive shapes moved in the darkness, of 13 ancient turtles swimming in formation around some vast and terrible presence. "The other 12, he whispered, understanding flooding through him. It's showing me where the other guardians are hidden. Miguel Santos crossed himself as Kane studied the sextant's readings. Capitan, perhaps we should leave this place. The very air feels cursed. But Kane was transfixed by the instrument's revelations. Each of the remaining 12 turtle guardians was scattered across the Caribbean, hidden in locations that formed a perfect circle around what the sextant indicated was the demon's prison. To break the curse completely, they would need to find them all. We're not the only ones seeking these artifacts, Drexel observed grimly, pointing toward the horizon where 3 ships had appeared. Looks like Spanish colors, but flying too low to be proper naval vessels. Kane raised his spyglass and cursed under his breath. The approaching vessels bore the distinctive modifications favored by Caribbean privateers. Extra gun ports, reinforced hulls, and the predatory lines of ships built for hunting rather than honest trade. Captain Esteban Vargas, Kane identified their leader. That Spanish dog has been tracking us. Vargas was notorious throughout the Caribbean for his brutal methods and supernatural obsession. He collected cursed artifacts and forbidden knowledge, the way other men collected gold, believing such power could make him master of the seas. If he learned about the Turtle Guardians and their connection to the Leviathan, the consequences would be catastrophic. As if responding to the approaching threat, the bone sextant began to grow warm in Kane's hands. The carved symbols pulsed with their own inner light, and he could hear something like whispers emanating from the artifact. Voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. All hands back to the ship, Kane commanded. We need to reach deep water before Vargas gets within cannon range. But even as his crew scrambled to return to the Widow's Revenge, Kane knew their troubles were just beginning. The first crew member had already paid the ultimate price for their supernatural quest. Young Billy Santos lay motionless on the wreck's deck, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror, though no one could determine what had killed him. The island of Calinago rose from the Caribbean like a green jewel, its volcanic peaks shrouded in mist and mystery. The native Caribs had lived here for centuries before European ships ever crossed the Atlantic, and their descendants still practiced rituals older than Christianity. Kane found the shaman, Akayuman, living in a palm-thatched hut overlooking a lagoon, where phosphorescent waters glowed with their own inner light. The old man's skin was weathered like ancient leather, marked with ritual scarifications that seemed to move in the flickering firelight. His dark eyes held depth that spoke of communion with forces beyond mortal understanding. You carry the scent of the deep waters, Akayuman said before Kane could speak. The Leviathan's touch marks your soul like a brand. Kane placed the bone sextant on the woven map between them. I need to understand what Blackheart awakened. My crew is dying. The shaman studied the artifact with obvious distaste, careful not to touch it directly. The pale-skinned captain thought he could master powers that my people have guarded for 1,000 generations. He was wrong, as you will be if you continue this path. Then help me end it. Akayuman reached into a carved wooden box and withdrew a medallion of jade green stone, its surface covered in symbols that predated any written language. Kane recognized. The moment the artifact appeared, the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on Kane's consciousness lifted slightly. This is a fragment of the first binding, the shaman explained. When the star spawn came from the deep places, my ancestors learned to forge barriers between their realm and ours. The 13 guardian turtles were part of that great working, each one carrying a piece of the original prison. Kane reached for the medallion, but Akayuman pulled it back. This protection comes with a price, Captain. The jade will shield you from the Leviathan's direct influence, but it will also corrupt your soul. Each day you wear it, you become less human and more like the thing you seek to defeat. What choice do I have? Without protection, my crew will all end up like Billy Santos. There is always a choice. You could abandon this quest, sail far from these waters, and live out your days in peace. The guardians would remain scattered, the binding would hold, and the demon would sleep for another 1,000 years. Kane considered the option seriously, He could take the surviving crew members somewhere safe, perhaps the colonies or even across the Atlantic to start fresh. But the bone sextant had shown him too much. Other ships were already seeking the Turtle Guardians, drawn by the same supernatural compulsion that had brought him to Devil's Cay. If he walked away, someone else would complete Blackheart's work. And that someone might not have the wisdom to realize what they were unleashing. "I'll take the medallion," Kane decided. A cowhuman nodded sadly and placed the jade artifact around Kane's neck. The relief was immediate and profound, as if a fever had broken or a crushing weight had been lifted from his chest. For the first time in days, Kane's thoughts felt entirely his own. "Remember, Captain, protection always demands sacrifice. The jade will preserve your mind, but it will claim pieces of your humanity. Do not wear it longer than absolutely necessary." That evening, Kane returned to the Widow's Revenge to find his crew in the grips of supernatural terror. 3 more men had died during his absence, found at dawn, with their faces frozen in expressions of absolute horror. The survivors huddled together in small groups, speaking in whispers and casting fearful glances at the sea. "It's getting worse," Captain Willem Drexel reported privately. "The dreams are coming during daylight now. Half the crew claims they can see shapes moving under the water, things too large to be natural." Kane felt the jade medallion pulse against his chest, its protection creating a buffer between his consciousness and the Leviathan's influence. But he could sense his crew's terror, their growing certainty that they were all doomed to share Billy Santos's fate. "Gather everyone on deck," Kane commanded. "It's time they understood what we're truly facing." As the crew assembled in the lantern light, Kane noticed how their eyes avoided his gaze. They could sense the change in him, the unnatural calm that the jade medallion provided. Some protection always came at a cost, and Kane was beginning to understand that his humanity might be the price he would ultimately pay to save his men. The chart appeared in Kane's cabin like a fever dream made manifest. He awoke to find it spread across his navigation table, the parchment still wet with what looked like fresh blood, despite the impossibility of its presence. The crimson ink seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, forming a map of the Caribbean that showed locations no earthly cartographer had ever recorded. 13 points of light glowed on the blood-drawn chart, each one marking the hiding place of a guardian turtle. Kane could see Devil's Cay where they'd found the first, the wreck of the Damnation's Pride where Blackheart had hidden clues to the others, and 11 more locations scattered across the sea like drops of starlight. But studying the chart too long brought consequences. Kane found himself losing track of time, sometimes standing over the bloody map for hours, while his mind wandered through visions of underwater cities and creatures that defied description. The jade medallion around his neck grew warm whenever he focused on the chart, fighting to protect his sanity from knowledge too vast for mortal comprehension. "Captain," Willem Drexel's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Captain Vargas has found us." Kane looked up from the chart to see 3 Spanish ships closing in from the northeast, their black sails billowing in the afternoon trade winds. Esteban Vargas commanded from the lead vessel, a heavily modified galleon bristling with cannon and crewed by men who served him more from fear than loyalty. "He's been tracking us since Devil's Cay," Kane realized. "The supernatural disturbances we're causing, they're like a beacon to anyone sensitive to such things." The attack came without warning or quarter. Vargas's ships opened fire while still at extreme range, their cannonballs whistling overhead in deadly arcs. But these weren't ordinary munitions. Kane watched in fascination and horror as the iron spheres trailed streams of green fire, and where they struck the water, the sea itself began to burn with unnatural flame. "Alchemical shot," Miguel Santos identified grimly. "Vargas has been experimenting with cursed weapons." The Widow's Revenge returned fire with conventional ammunition, but her lighter guns were no match for the Spanish galleon's artillery. Kane's crew fought with desperate courage, knowing that surrender to Vargas meant fates worse than death. The Spanish captain was known for his experiments on captured pirates, seeking to unlock supernatural secrets through torture and ritual sacrifice. During the height of the battle, something extraordinary happened. The blood-drawn chart began to react to the violence, its crimson lines shifting and writhing as if alive. New details appeared in the parchment underwater passages, hidden reefs, and most importantly, the location of what the map labeled as the sunken garden. There, Kane pointed to a section of ocean that appeared empty on conventional charts, but showed intricate detail on the blood map. That's where we'll find the next guardian turtle, but reaching their destination would require surviving Vargas's assault. The Spanish ships had formed a triangle around the Widow's Revenge, their cannons firing in synchronized volleys that left no safe direction for escape. It was then that Seamus O'Grady made his fatal sacrifice. The Irish bosun had been growing increasingly unstable since his possession episode, muttering to himself in languages that belonged to no human culture. During the battle's climax, he suddenly ran to the ship's magazine where their gunpowder was stored. For the deep waters, O'Grady screamed in that alien voice before igniting the powder stores. The explosion that followed was beyond anything Kane had ever witnessed. Instead of destroying the Widow's Revenge, the blast created a massive whirlpool that dragged two of Vargas's ships beneath the waves. Unnatural lightning crackled across the water's surface, and for a moment, Kane could have sworn he saw something vast and tentacled rising from the ocean depths before submerging again. O'Grady's sacrifice had bought them escape, but at a terrible cost. The bosun was gone, consumed by the supernatural forces he'd unleashed, and his final act had attracted the attention of something far more dangerous than Spanish privateers. The remaining Spanish ship limped away, damaged but not destroyed. Kane knew Vargas would return with reinforcements and better understanding of the forces they were all meddling with. As the Widow's Revenge sailed toward the coordinates shown on the blood chart, Kane found himself studying the crimson map with increasing obsession. Each time he looked at it, new details appeared, symbols that hurt to perceive directly, passages that led to dimensions beyond human understanding, and always at the center of it all, the growing sense that they were being drawn into a trap older than civilization itself. The jade medallion around his neck pulsed with protective energy, but Kane could feel its influence changing him. His reflection in the cabin's mirror showed eyes that had begun to take on the same greenish tint as the supernatural waters they sailed. The conch shell appeared in Kane's cabin the morning after O'Grady's sacrifice, sitting on his chart table as if it had always belonged there. Unlike ordinary shells bleached white by sun and salt, this artifact was deep purple-black with veins of silver that pulsed like a heartbeat. When Kane held it to his ear, instead of the ocean's roar, he heard voices, whispers from beyond the grave, speaking in words he somehow understood, despite their alien origin. Captain Kane, came a voice unmistakably belonging to Mordecai Blackheart himself. You have found my final gift. Through this shell, the barrier between the living and the dead grows thin. Kane nearly dropped the conch in shock. The voice was so clear, so present, that he looked around his cabin expecting to see Blackheart's ghost, standing in the shadows. But he was alone with only the whispers emanating from the supernatural artifact. You're dead, Kane said to the empty air, feeling foolish for talking to a shell. Death is merely another ocean to navigate, Blackheart's voice replied. I have been watching your progress with great interest. You are making the same mistakes I made, driven by the same arrogance that doomed my crew. Then, help me avoid your fate. Blackheart's ghostly laughter echoed from the conch shell with bitter amusement. I tried to master the Leviathan, to bind it to my will and command the seas themselves. The creature was already imprisoned by the 13 guardians, but I thought I could break that prison and forge new chains with myself as the master. Kane studied the blood-drawn chart spread before him, seeing the locations of the remaining turtle guardians with new understanding. The treasure you sought, it wasn't gold. Gold? Blackheart's voice carried infinite scorn. What use is mere wealth when you can command a force older than human civilization? The Leviathan offers power beyond imagination. The ability to sink any ship, control any storm, rule every ocean on Earth. But such power comes with a price I was too proud to pay. What price? The demon requires a willing soul to serve as its anchor in the mortal realm. Not a slave or victim, but a conscious partner, who chooses to merge their essence with its primordial hunger. I gathered the 13 guardians, prepared the ritual, but when the moment came for that final sacrifice, I hesitated. The conch shell grew warm in Kane's hands as Blackheart's spirit channeled more energy into their communication. Kane could feel the artifact drawing something from him with each exchange, not just life force, but pieces of his humanity that would never return. My hesitation doomed us all. Blackheart continued. The ritual began, but could not be completed. The Leviathan partially awakened but remained bound, driving my crew mad with visions of what they had almost unleashed. One by one, they threw themselves into the sea rather than endure another day of its whispers in their minds. Kane felt a chill of recognition. His own crew was beginning to show similar symptoms: the nightmares, the supernatural visions, the growing madness that came from exposure to forces beyond human comprehension. "Is there a way to reverse what you started?" Kane asked desperately. "Only one way," Blackheart replied. "The ritual must be completed, but not as I intended. Instead of freeing the Leviathan, the 13th Guardian, the one you found on Devil's Cay, must be returned to its place in the binding circle, but doing so requires a willing sacrifice from someone who has been touched by the demon's power." Kane understood the implication immediately. He had been marked from the moment he touched the cursed turtle. The jade medallion around his neck provided protection, but it also made him a suitable candidate for the sacrifice Blackheart had been unwilling to make. "There's something else you must know." Blackheart's voice grew urgent. "Your first mate, Willem Drexel, he's not what he seems. The man who has served you faithfully for years was replaced 3 days ago when the possession began spreading through your crew." Kane's blood turned to ice. "What are you talking about? Look at him carefully, Captain. Study his eyes, listen to his voice, watch how he moves." The real Willem Drexel died the same night as Billy Santos, but the creature wearing his face has been waiting for the right moment to strike. As if summoned by their conversation, Drexel's voice called from outside Kane's cabin door. "Captain, we need to discuss our course. The men are asking questions about where we're headed." Kane clutched the conch shell tighter, feeling Blackheart's presence fading as the supernatural communication drained his strength. "Trust no one completely," the dead pirate's voice whispered. "The Leviathan's corruption spreads like a plague, turning friend against friend, loyalty into betrayal. Only you can decide whether save your world or damn it." The mirror of obsidian appeared in Kane's cabin overnight, leaning against the bulkhead as if it had always been there. Its surface was darker than the deepest ocean trench, framed in carved bone that depicted scenes of maritime horror: ships consumed by tentacles, sailors transformed into creatures of the deep, and at the center of it all, a vast eye that seemed to watch from beyond the glass. Kane approached the artifact with growing dread. Something about the mirror called to him with the same inexorable pull he'd felt when first touching the cursed turtle on Devil's Cay. The jade medallion around his neck grew warm in warning, but even its protective influence couldn't completely shield him from the mirror's supernatural magnetism. "Don't look," he whispered to himself, even as his hand reached toward the obsidian surface, but resistance proved futile. The moment his fingers touched the mirror's edge, visions flooded his consciousness with overwhelming force. He saw himself as the Leviathan saw him, not as the practical, skeptical captain he believed himself to be, but as a man whose soul had been systematically hollowed out and filled with alien hunger. The reflection staring back at him bore his face, but the eyes belonged to something else entirely. They were the deep green of abyssal waters, flecked with points of light, like bioluminescent creatures, swimming in eternal darkness. His skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality that revealed dark veins pulsing beneath the surface. "No." Kane backed away from the mirror, but the vision followed him. He could see the corruption spreading through his body like ink through water, transforming him cell by cell into something that could serve as the Leviathan's anchor in the mortal realm. The jade medallion had not been protecting him, it had been preparing him. Each day he wore it, each supernatural encounter he survived, had made him more suitable as a vessel for the demon's consciousness. The shaman Akuman had lied, or perhaps he had been deceived by forces far older and more cunning than human understanding could grasp. Kane sank into his chair, staring at hands that no longer looked entirely human. How long had this transformation been occurring? Days, weeks. The mirror showed him the truth his ordinary reflection had hidden. He was becoming something else, something that could channel the Leviathan's power without being destroyed by it. "Captain?" Willem Drexel's voice called from outside the cabin door. "The lads are asking about our destination. They deserve to know what we're sailing toward." Kane studied the door with new understanding. Blackheart's warning about Drexel being replaced made perfect sense now. The Leviathan needed agents among his crew, creatures that could guide him toward completing the ritual while maintaining the illusion of loyal service. "Enter," Kane called, watching carefully as his first mate stepped into the cabin. Drexel moved with the same confident stride he'd always possessed, but now Kane could see the subtle wrongness in his posture. The real Willem had favored his left leg. Injured years ago during a battle with Spanish treasure ships, this creature moved with perfect balance, forgetting to maintain the deception. "The mirror troubles you," Drexel observed, his eyes reflecting the obsidian surface with unnatural intensity. "You begin to see the truth of what you're becoming." Kane's hand moved instinctively to his pistol. "What are you?" "I am what your friend Willem chose to become rather than die in madness like Billy Santos. The Leviathan offers transformation to those wise enough to accept its gifts. Your first mate embraced that change willingly. Where is the real Willem?" "He is here, Captain, merged with something greater than his limited human consciousness could have imagined. He remembers serving you, remembers your friendship, but now he understands purposes that transcend mortal loyalty." The thing wearing Drexel's face stepped closer to the mirror, and Kane saw its reflection clearly for the first time. The image showed not his trusted first mate, but a writhing mass of tentacles and teeth, wearing human features like an ill-fitting mask. "You cannot stop what has already begun," the creature continued. "The ritual will be completed, the Leviathan will be freed, and you will serve as its voice in this realm. The only choice remaining is whether you embrace your destiny willingly or fight it until madness claims your mind." Kane drew his pistol and aimed it at the creature's chest. "I still have choices. Do you look in the mirror again, Captain? See what you truly are." Against his will, Kane's eyes turned toward the obsidian surface. The reflection showed not just his physical transformation, but the spiritual corruption spreading through his soul like gangrene. He was already more Leviathan than human, and with each passing hour, the balance shifted further toward the inhuman. The heart of the depths revealed itself when Kane's blood spilled onto the obsidian mirror. A single drop from his transformed veins struck the surface, and the glass dissolved like morning mist, revealing a hidden compartment that had been waiting centuries for the right moment to open. Inside lay a pearl the size of a human heart, black as the void between stars, yet somehow radiating its own terrible light. The moment Kane's eyes fell upon it, he understood with crystalline clarity that this was no treasure in any conventional sense. This was a prison, and something unimaginably vast pressed against its boundaries like a caged hurricane. "The heart of the depths," the thing wearing William's face whispered with reverence. "The true treasure that Captain Blackheart died trying to claim. Within that pearl sleeps the Leviathan, bound by the combined will of 13 guardian spirits." Kane reached toward the artifact, despite every instinct screaming warnings. The moment his fingers made contact with its surface, visions exploded through his consciousness with the force of a tidal wave. He saw the pearl's creation in an age before human civilization, when his own ancestors had sailed these waters in crude vessels and worshipped gods whose names were forbidden to speak. But these weren't just any ancestors. They were Kane's, bearing the same weathered features and steel-gray eyes that had marked his bloodline for generations. He watched in horrified fascination as they participated in the great binding ritual, offering their lives and souls to create the prison that held the Leviathan captive. The Kane family, he whispered, understanding flooding through him like poison. We weren't just random pirates who stumbled onto this curse. Your bloodline has been bound to the Leviathan's prison for 3 centuries, the false Willem confirmed. Each generation produced at least one descendant who would be called to serve as guardian, to ensure the binding remained strong. But your ancestor Ezekiel Kane grew proud and greedy. More visions flowed from the pearl's dark surface. Kane saw Ezekiel, his great-great-grandfather, turning away from his sacred duty to pursue easier wealth through piracy. The abandonment of his family's responsibility had weakened the prison's bonds, allowing the Leviathan's influence to seep into the mortal realm like spiritual poison. Blackheart was drawn here by that weakening. Kane realized he wasn't seeking treasure, he was responding to the same call that brought me to Devil's Cay. The demon needs an anchor in the mortal realm, someone with the right bloodline who can channel its power without being immediately destroyed. Blackheart lacked the proper heritage, but he found records of the Kane family's involvement in the original binding. He spent years tracking your lineage, waiting for the right descendant to appear. Kane felt the pearl's surface grow warm beneath his palm. Inside the prison, something stirred with malevolent intelligence. The Leviathan had been waiting for him specifically, not just any pirate captain, but the heir to a legacy he'd never known existed. My father, Kane said, memory fragments falling into place. He died at sea when I was 12. But it wasn't an accident, was it? Your father tried to fulfill the family duty, to strengthen the binding, as his ancestors had done. But the ritual required a willing sacrifice, and he couldn't bring himself to complete it. The Leviathan's revenge was... Kane remembered finding his father's ship drifting empty near these same waters. Her crew vanished without explanation. He'd always assumed pirates or storms were responsible, but now he understood the truth. His father had died trying to maintain a supernatural prison, and his failure had passed the burden to the next generation. So I have no choice, Kane said, feeling the weight of 3 centuries settling on his shoulders. Either I complete the ritual and die maintaining the prison, or I free the Leviathan and watch it destroy the world. There is a third option, the false Willem said with something approaching sympathy. You could join with the demon willingly, become its partner rather than its victim. The Leviathan doesn't desire destruction. It seeks to reshape this realm according to its ancient vision. Oceans without boundaries, where mortals and elder things coexist in harmony. Kane stared into the pearl's depths, seeing visions of what such a world might look like. Cities beneath the waves where humans breathed water like air. Ships that sailed between dimensions, storms that carried messages from gods whose names were music itself. It was beautiful and terrible, alien yet somehow familiar. But he also saw the cost. Every human soul transformed or consumed, every trace of the world he'd known erased in favor of something that served inhuman purposes. The choice before him was clear: die as a guardian maintaining an ancient prison, or live as a herald of humanity's transformation into something unrecognizable. The 13 keys appeared across Kane's chart table like constellation points, each one a miniature turtle shell carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. They had been hidden throughout his ship since the beginning of their quest, planted by forces that understood his destiny better than he did himself. Now they called to each other with harmonious vibrations that made the widow's revenge's timbers sing like a vast musical instrument. Kane gathered the keys with hands that no longer looked entirely human, feeling each artifact pulse with bound spiritual energy. These were fragments of the original 13 guardians, compressed into physical tokens that could either strengthen the Leviathan's prison or shatter it completely, depending on how they were arranged. The final phase begins, the thing wearing William's face observed from across the cabin. Captain Thaddeus approaches from the northeast with reinforcements, 5 ships now instead of 3. He's allied himself with the French privateer Lucien Dubois and his squadron. They believe they're hunting treasure, but they're actually racing to complete the ritual before you do. Kane studied the blood-drawn chart, seeing new details that revealed themselves only now that all 13 keys were assembled. The Leviathan's actual prison lay in the deepest trench of the Caribbean, a place where the ocean floor dropped away into abyssal darkness that no sunlight had ever touched. If Thaddeus reaches the site first, he'll attempt to free the demon, believing he can control it as Blackheart tried to do. But Thaddeus lacks your bloodline connection. The Leviathan will consume him and his crews, then break free into a world unprepared for its presence. Kane felt the weight of impossible responsibility settling on his shoulders. Every choice led to catastrophe. Completing the binding would cost his life and the lives of his crew, but failing to act would unleash a force that could remake the world according to alien desires. There's something else you need to understand, the false Willem continued. Your remaining crew members, the ones who haven't been transformed or driven mad, they've been changing too. The proximity to so many cursed artifacts has marked them all. Even if we turn back now, they'll never be fully human again. As if summoned by this revelation, Tommy Hartwell appeared at the cabin door, but the young man Kane remembered was gone. In his place stood something that retained Tommy's basic shape, while adding details that belonged in nightmares. His skin had taken on the translucent quality of deep-sea creatures, and gills fluttered along his neck with each breath. "Cap'n," Tommy said in a voice that echoed like whale song, "the lads are asking when we reach the deep water. We can feel it calling to us, promising peace beneath the waves." Kane realized with growing horror that his crew's transformation wasn't an accident. It was preparation. The Leviathan had been changing them into beings capable of surviving in whatever realm would exist after the prison was broken. They were becoming the first citizens of a new world order. "How many of the original crew remain unchanged?" Kane asked. "Miguel Santos retains his humanity, though barely," Tommy replied. "Johannes Schmidt fights the change but grows weaker each day. The rest have embraced what they're becoming. We dream of swimming through liquid starlight and breathing songs that reshape reality." Kane gathered the 13 keys into a leather pouch, feeling their combined energy thrumming against his transformed flesh. Each decision point in this nightmare had been orchestrated to bring him to this moment, alone except for creatures that served powers beyond human understanding, carrying artifacts that could either save or damn the world. "The ritual site lies 12 hours sailing southeast," he announced. "Signal the crew to prepare for deep water. We end this before Vargas can interfere." But even as he spoke, Kane wondered if he was making the choice freely or simply fulfilling a role that had been written for him centuries before his birth. The Leviathan's influence was subtle and pervasive, turning even acts of defiance into steps along a predetermined path. As the widow's revenge changed course toward the deepest waters of the Caribbean, Kane felt the 13 keys growing warmer in their pouch. Soon he would have to decide not just his own fate, but the fate of every living thing that called the ocean home. Behind them, Vargas's enlarged fleet gave chase with supernatural speed, their ships moving faster than any natural wind could drive them. The final race had begun, and its outcome would determine whether humanity faced extinction, transformation, or the slim possibility of salvation through ultimate sacrifice. The ancestral cutlass materialized in Kane's cabin as the sun reached its zenith, appearing on his bunk like a gift from the grave. The blade was unlike any weapon he'd ever seen, forged from metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its edge inscribed with the same symbols that marked every cursed artifact in their collection. The hilt was wrapped in leather that still bore the fingerprints of generations of Kane ancestors, each one who had wielded it, leaving their mark on the weapon's spiritual essence. Kane lifted the cutlass and immediately felt the weight of 3 centuries pressing against his consciousness. Visions flooded through the blade's touch. His great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel, using it to cut the spiritual bonds that had bound the Leviathan, his father drawing it with trembling hands before ultimately lacking the courage to complete his duty, and dozens of other Kane men and women who had faced the same impossible choice. The weapon's true purpose became clear as Kane examined its supernatural properties. This was no ordinary sword. It could cut through more than flesh and bone. The blade was designed to sever spiritual connections, to slice through the mystical bonds that held souls together or imprisoned cosmic entities. In the right hands, it could strengthen the Leviathan's prison by severing its connections to the mortal realm. But using it for such a purpose would cost the wielder their life, channeling their entire essence into the binding ritual. Your family's ultimate weapon, the false Willem observed with something approaching respect. Forged in the same ritual that created the original prison, tempered in the blood of willing martyrs, sharpened on the souls of those who chose duty over survival. Kane tested the blade's balance, finding it perfectly suited to his grip, despite never having held it before. The cutlass knew him, recognized his bloodline, and hummed with anticipation of fulfilling its purpose after decades of waiting. "The ritual site lies ahead," he announced, moving to the cabin's windows where he could see the ocean floor dropping away into impossible depths. The water here was different, darker, heavier, as if the liquid itself carried the weight of primordial secrets. Strange lights flickered in the depths, and occasionally something vast and tentacled moved through the darkness far below. On deck, his transformed crew prepared for what they all understood would be their final voyage. Miguel Santos, still clinging to his humanity, worked alongside creatures that had once been his shipmates. Tommy Hartwell's gills fluttered as he breathed both air and the moisture-heavy atmosphere that surrounded the abyssal waters. Even Johannes Schmidt had begun showing signs of change, webbing between his fingers, eyes that reflected light like a deep-sea fish. "Captain," Miguel called out, his voice heavy with emotion and fear. "The lads wanted me to tell you whatever happens down there, we're grateful you gave us the choice to see this through. Most captains would have abandoned us when the changes began." Kane felt his heart breaking for these men, who had followed him into damnation with loyalty that transcended human understanding. They deserved better than to die in service to cosmic forces they couldn't comprehend, but fate had given them no other options. Behind them, Vargas's fleet had closed the distance significantly. The Spanish privateer's ships moved with unnatural speed, their hulls glowing with phosphorescent symbols that suggested he, too, had bargained with supernatural forces. But Vargas's alliance with the otherworldly came from greed rather than heritage. He sought to command the Leviathan rather than contain it. Kane strapped the ancestral cutlass to his side and gathered the 13 keys, feeling their combined weight like stones in his soul. The leather pouch containing them had grown warm to the touch, and occasionally he could hear whispers emanating from within, voices of the original guardians calling across centuries of imprisonment. As the widow's revenge reached the coordinates marked on the blood-drawn chart, the ocean around them began to change. The water took on an oily consistency that reflected images of underwater cities and creatures that belonged in nightmares rather than the natural world. Whirlpools formed spontaneously, creating temporary passages that revealed glimpses of the depths where something enormous waited with infinite patience. "Prepare to drop anchor," Kane commanded, though he knew the chains would find no purchase in the supernatural waters above the Leviathan's prison. "Signal the crew. Anyone who wishes to say final prayers should do so now." The ancestral cutlass pulsed against his hip like a second heartbeat, eager to fulfill the destiny it had been forged to serve. But first, Kane would have to survive the descent into waters where the boundary between reality and nightmare dissolved completely. The Leviathan's chains became visible the moment Kane descended beneath the waves, their massive spiritual links stretching through dimensions that human eyes were never meant to perceive. Each chain was forged from the willing sacrifice of ancient guardians, their souls transformed into unbreakable bonds that held the demon in its abyssal prison. But 3 centuries of neglect had weakened the bindings until they appeared more like gossamer threads than the mighty restraints they had once been. Kane swam through the supernatural waters with gills that had sprouted along his neck during the descent, his transformation finally complete. The ancestral cutlass in his hand glowed with its own inner light, illuminating the underwater battlefield where the final confrontation would take place. Around him swam the remnants of his crew, their human forms abandoned in favor of shapes better suited for the liquid realm they now called home. Above them, the battle between Vargas's fleet and the spectral guardians of the depths raged across the ocean's surface. Spanish cannon fire mixed with otherworldly energies as creatures that had slept for millennia rose to defend their ancient prison. But Vargas had come prepared for supernatural warfare, his ships protected by wards and crewed by men who had sold their souls for the power to face cosmic horrors. At the center of the underwater maelstrom lay the Leviathan itself, partially awakened by the disturbance, but still bound by the weakening chains. Kane had expected a creature of tentacles and teeth, something that matched the sea monster legends told in taverns across the Caribbean. Instead, he found himself facing something far more alien and terrible, a living void that existed in dimensions beyond physical form. A consciousness so vast that even perceiving its edges threatened to shatter his sanity. So comes the last of the Kane bloodline. The Leviathan spoke without words, its voice resonating directly through Kane's transformed flesh. "Will you strengthen my prison, as your ancestors did, or will you free me to reshape this realm according to ancient design?" Kane studied the weakening chains, understanding that he possessed the power to choose either path. The ancestral cutlass could cut through the spiritual bonds entirely, releasing the demon to wreak havoc on the world above. Or he could use the 13 keys to forge new links, binding himself into the prison structure as the ultimate guardian at the cost of his existence. There is a third way, Kane realized, his mind touched by inspiration that might have been divine intervention, or simply the desperate creativity of a man facing impossible choices. The chains don't have to bind you completely. They could be restructured to allow controlled interaction with our realm. The Leviathan's attention focused on him with crushing intensity. Explained, "You seek to reshape the world, but destruction serves no one's purpose. Instead of breaking free entirely or remaining completely bound, we could establish agreements. Limited manifestation in exchange for protection of the ocean realms you consider sacred." It was a gamble born of desperation, but Kane saw possibility in the demon's cosmic loneliness. The Leviathan had been imprisoned for millennia, cut off from the universe it had once helped shape. Perhaps what it truly desired wasn't conquest, but connection, a chance to participate in cosmic evolution rather than being excluded from it. "You would trust a creature your people considered demonic?" the Leviathan asked, something like amusement coloring its mental voice. "I would trust an entity intelligent enough to recognize mutual benefit," Kane replied, raising the ancestral cutlass. "But the choice must be made now, before Vargas reaches the depths." Above them, explosions rocked the water as Spanish ships engaged supernatural defenders in battles that defied natural law. Vargas himself had begun descending toward the prison site, protected by alchemical devices that allowed him to breathe underwater while maintaining his human form. Kane made his decision. Instead of either binding or freeing the Leviathan completely, he used the ancestral cutlass to modify the existing chains, restructuring them into something more like a complex contract than simple restraints. The 13 keys provided the material for new clauses in the supernatural agreement, limitations and permissions that would allow the demon limited influence while preventing catastrophic intervention. The process required everything Kane had to give. His life force, his humanity, his very essence flowed into the restructured bindings, transforming him from guardian to mediator between realms. As the new chains took hold, he felt himself becoming something between mortal and cosmic entity, no longer fully human, but not entirely other. The Leviathan's form shifted as the modified prison took effect, its chaotic energy channeled into more manageable manifestations. Instead of unleashing destruction, it began to reshape the underwater realm into something beautiful and alien, creating new forms of life that bridged the gap between dimensions. The Guardian's crown manifested around Kane's transformed head as the new covenant took hold, its coral branches growing from his skull like living bone. The artifact was not worn, but integrated, becoming part of his altered anatomy as he assumed his role as eternal mediator between the human and cosmic realms. Each branch pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that reflected the complex terms of the supernatural contract he had forged. Kane felt his consciousness expand beyond individual awareness, touching minds across the Caribbean and sensing the delicate balance he now existed to maintain. The Leviathan's presence pressed against the edges of his perception, vast, alien, but no longer malevolent. Their agreement had transformed mutual antagonism into an unlikely partnership that neither had anticipated, but the Covenant's establishment had attracted unwanted attention. Captain Vargas burst into the underwater chamber with supernatural fury, his alchemically enhanced form bristling with weapons designed to harm spiritual entities. Behind him came a dozen of his most fanatical followers, their eyes burning with the reflected madness of men who had stared too deeply into cosmic mysteries. "You dare steal what rightfully belongs to those strong enough to claim it," Vargas screamed, his voice carrying clearly through the water thanks to the cursed apparatus that allowed him to function in the depths. The Leviathan's power should serve human ambition, not coddle it with negotiated weakness. Kane turned to face his adversary, feeling the Guardian's crown shift and adjust to focus his enhanced abilities. Through its coral branches, he could perceive Vargas's true nature, a man so consumed by greed and pride that he had become something barely recognizable as human. The Spanish privateer had made bargains with forces that promised power, but delivered only spiritual corruption. "The old way of thinking brought nothing but destruction," Kane replied, his voice resonating with harmonics that belonged to depths no human had ever explored. "Dominion through force creates only enemies. Cooperation creates possibilities." Vargas drew his cursed cutlass, its blade wreathed in green fire that could wound entities existing across multiple dimensions. Pretty words from a man who has abandoned his own species. "You are no longer human, Kane. You are a traitor to your entire race." The accusation struck deeper than any physical weapon could have reached. Kane felt the weight of his transformation, the price he had paid to forge a new kind of peace. He was neither human nor cosmic entity, but something between, forever standing at the threshold between worlds. "Perhaps," Kane admitted, raising his own ancestral blade, "but someone must bear that burden, or both worlds suffer." The battle that followed transcended physical combat. Vargas attacked with weapons and techniques designed to shatter spiritual bonds and disrupt supernatural contracts. His enhanced strength and alchemical protections made him a formidable opponent even in the alien environment of the underwater prison. But Kane fought with the backing of the newly forged Covenant. The Leviathan lent him access to cosmic energies that could reshape reality itself, while the Guardian's crown provided the wisdom to use such power responsibly. Where Vargas sought to dominate through superior force, Kane defended through adaptive strategy and the kind of deep understanding that came from true partnership. The climactic moment arrived when Vargas attempted to shatter the modified chains that held the new agreement in place. His cursed blade struck the nearest spiritual link with force that should have suited any binding, but instead of breaking, the chains absorbed the attack and redirected its energy back at the aggressor. Vargas screamed as his own weapon's power turned against him, the green fire consuming his enhanced form from within. But instead of dying, he began to transform not into something greater as he had hoped, but into a cautionary example of what happened when mortal ambition collided with cosmic forces it couldn't comprehend. "This is not possible," Vargas gasped as his body dissolved into component elements that were immediately absorbed by the underwater realm. "I had the power of ancient gods behind me. You had borrowed power with strings attached," Kane explained sadly. "The entities you bargained with never intended to honor their promises. They used your ambition to create a weapon against the new covenant, but weapons can be turned against their makers." As Vargas and his followers dissolved into the supernatural waters, Kane felt the Guardian's crown pulse with new knowledge. The attempted attack had actually strengthened the Covenant by testing its resilience against direct assault. The Leviathan's trust in their partnership grew deeper, while Kane's understanding of his role as mediator expanded to encompass threats he had never imagined. The battle was won, but Kane understood that this victory marked the beginning rather than the end of his responsibilities. As the Eternal Guardian, he would face challenges that tested both the Covenant's stability and his own commitment to preserving the balance between worlds. The Memory Stone formed in Kane's transformed hands as he prepared his final message to the surviving crew, its crystalline surface capturing not just words, but the full emotional weight of everything they had experienced together. The artifact pulsed with soft blue light as it recorded his thoughts, preserving them in a format that would remain unchanged for centuries to come. "My faithful friends," Kane began, his voice carrying harmonics that belonged to both human speech and the deep song of the ocean itself. "What we have accomplished here will reshape the relationship between our world and the cosmic forces that surround it. But that accomplishment comes with a price that I alone must pay." Through the crystal's surface, he watched his surviving crew members processing the magnet of their transformation. Miguel Santos had retained most of his human appearance, though his eyes now held depths that reflected intimate knowledge of supernatural mysteries. Tommy Hartwell had become something beautiful and alien, his transformed body perfectly adapted for life in the spaces between air and water. Even Johannes Schmidt, despite his initial resistance to change, had found peace in his new form. "The covenant I forged with the Leviathan requires a permanent guardian," Kane continued, feeling the Memory Stone absorb every nuance of his explanation. "Someone to stand at the threshold between realms, ensuring that neither side violates the agreements we have established. That guardian must be me, transformed as I am, no longer fully human but not entirely other." The coral crown growing from his skull pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that corresponded to his emotional state, creating a light show that his crew found both mesmerizing and heartbreaking. They understood that their captain was explaining why he could never return to the world above, never again walk on dry land or breathe unfiltered air. "But your sacrifice is not meaningless," Kane assured them, the Memory Stone faithfully recording his conviction. "The Leviathan has agreed to protect the Caribbean waters from threats that ordinary humans could never face. Storms will be gentler, sea monsters will avoid shipping lanes, and the deep places will offer sanctuary to those who respect their mysteries." Miguel Santos stepped forward, his transformation-enhanced voice carrying clearly through the water. "Captain, what about us? We can't return to Port Royal looking like this. The colonial authorities would burn us as demons, and rightfully so by their understanding." Kane had anticipated this concern, and the Memory Stone captured his response along with the deep sadness that accompanied it. "You have choices, my friends. The Leviathan has opened passages to realms where beings like yourselves are welcomed as explorers rather than feared as monsters. You could establish new communities in places where the boundary between dimensions grows thin." Tommy Hartwell's gills fluttered as he processed this information. "And if we choose to stay in this realm, then you become guardians in your own right," Kane explained. "Not bound to the depths as I am, but serving as bridges between the transformed Caribbean and the human world above. You could help others who undergo similar changes, guide ships away from dangerous waters, or simply explore the new wonders that our covenant has made possible." The Memory Stone pulsed more brightly as Kane reached the most important part of his message. "Whatever you choose, remember this. We did not fail in our quest for treasure. We discovered something far more valuable than gold or jewels. We found the possibility of coexistence between forces that have been at war since the dawn of time." He paused, allowing the artifact to capture the weight of their shared experience. "Keep this Memory Stone safe. Hide it where future generations might find it, if the Covenant ever faces threats beyond my ability to handle alone. Let them understand that the choice we made was not surrender, but transformation. Not an ending, but a new beginning." Johannes Schmidt, his Germanic practicality intact, despite his physical changes, asked the question they all harbored. "Will we see you again, Captain?" Kane's transformed features softened with something approaching his old human warmth. "When ships pass over these waters, when storms threaten innocent vessels, when the balance between realms needs adjustment, I will be there. Changed, but still your captain, still your friend, still bound to you by loyalty that transcends any physical transformation. The memory stone completed its recording with a pulse of brilliant light that illuminated the underwater chamber like a miniature sun. As the artifact's glow faded, Kane's crew understood that they were witnessing the end of one chapter of their lives and the beginning of another they could scarcely imagine. The testament scroll materialized on the deck of the Widow's Revenge as the surviving crew members surfaced from the depths, its parchment sealed with wax that bore the mark of Kane's transformed seal, a ship crowned with corals sailing between worlds. Miguel Santos broke the seal with trembling fingers that still showed traces of his underwater transformation, unrolling the document that would serve as both historical record and warning for future generations. Written in Kane's careful hand but infused with knowledge that came from his communion with cosmic force, the testament began with words that chilled them despite the Caribbean sun warming their backs. To those who find this record, know that the sea holds mysteries deeper than any treasure chest, and some discoveries change not just the finder, but the very nature of reality itself. The document chronicled their entire journey from the cursed turtle on Devil's Cay to the forging of the supernatural covenant. But it did more than simply record events. Kane had somehow imbued the parchment with protective qualities that would shield readers from the madness that typically accompanied knowledge of cosmic truths. Read this aloud, Miguel instructed the others, understanding instinctively that the testament was meant to be shared rather than studied in isolation. The captain designed it to be spoken, not just seen. As Tommy Hartwell began reading in his transformed voice that carried harmonics of deep ocean currents, the testament revealed layers of meaning that went beyond its written words. Maps appeared in the margins showing safe passages through supernaturally dangerous waters. Symbols manifested between the lines that could ward off creatures attracted to ships carrying cursed artifacts. Most importantly, instructions emerged for recognizing and contacting Kane if the Covenant ever faced existential threat. Should the balance between realms grow unstable, Tommy read, his voice taking on some of Kane's authoritative tone. Gather 13 pieces of coral from the site where we first found the Turtle Guardian. Cast them into the deepest water you can find while speaking these words. The incantation that followed was written in a script that seemed to shift and change as they watched, ensuring that only those with legitimate need could decipher it. Johannes Schmidt, still adjusting to his own transformation, but driven by his Germanic sense of duty, took up the reading when Tommy's voice grew hoarse. The Leviathan has agreed to certain limitations on its influence, but these agreements require active maintenance. Those who understand this covenant must establish a secret society dedicated to monitoring supernatural activities throughout the Caribbean. The testament went on to outline the structure of this organization, not a traditional pirate crew bound by greed and violence, but a network of guardians united by understanding of forces beyond normal human comprehension. Each member would be responsible for specific territories, watching for signs that the delicate balance Kane had established might be threatened. We're not pirates anymore, Miguel realized, the truth settling over them like morning mist. We're something entirely new. The final sections of the testament addressed the practical concerns of their new existence. Their transformed appearances would make returning to conventional civilization impossible, but the document provided alternative hidden settlements established by others who had undergone similar changes, underwater cities where air breathers and water dwellers coexisted, and islands where the boundary between dimensions grew thin enough to allow passage to realms better suited for their evolved forms. Some of you will choose to remain in waters familiar to your human memories, the testament concluded. Others will venture into realms that exist beyond conventional maps. All paths have value, but remember you carry knowledge that could either save or damn the world, depending on how wisely it is used. As the crew finished reading, they noticed that the Widow's Revenge herself had begun to change. The ship's timbers took on a subtle luminescence that would allow her to navigate supernatural waters safely. Her sails now caught winds from dimensions beyond the purely physical, granting speed and maneuverability that no ordinary vessel could match. They were no longer just the survivors of Captain Kane's final voyage. They had become the founding members of an organization that would guard the Caribbean's supernatural secrets for generations to come. The testament would serve as their charter, the memory stone as their sacred relic, and Kane's sacrifice as their inspiration. "Where do we go first?" Tommy asked, testing his new voice's ability to carry across both air and water. Miguel looked toward the horizon, where morning light painted the sea in shades of gold and possibility. "Wherever the world needs guardians who understand that some treasures are too dangerous to claim, and some knowledge too important to ignore." The lighthouse lens was installed 5 years after the Covenant's establishment, its crystal surface ground from fragments of the original memory stone and mounted atop a beacon tower built on the highest point of Devils. The lens possessed the remarkable ability to focus both ordinary light and supernatural emanations, allowing Kane's transformed consciousness to project guidance across vast distances, while maintaining his vigil in the depths below. Miguel Santos, now the acknowledged leader of the Guardian Society, supervised the lens installation with the help of craftsmen who had been carefully selected for their ability to work with materials that existed partially in other dimensions. The tower itself was constructed from coral that had grown in the Leviathan's domain, its living walls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that served as both decoration and protective ward. Testing the connection now, Miguel called down to the waters below, where a shimmering disturbance marked Kane's presence near the surface. The lighthouse lens blazed to life with radiance that was visible for miles across the Caribbean, its beam carrying messages that only those touched by supernatural transformation could fully understand. Kane's voice reached them through the lens, no longer entirely human but retaining the warmth and authority that had made him a beloved captain. "The link is strong. I can see ships approaching from 3 directions, merchant vessels that have strayed into dangerous waters. Guide them to safety while I deal with the creatures that have been following their scent." The lens had become more than just a communication device. It served as Kane's primary tool for protecting Caribbean shipping from threats that conventional navigation could never anticipate. Through its focused emanations, he could project warnings directly into the minds of experienced sailors, guide them away from supernatural hazards, or in extreme cases manifest physical interventions that appeared to be nothing more than fortunate weather patterns or helpful currents. Tommy Hartwell, his transformation now complete into something resembling a humanoid dolphin, surfaced near the lighthouse's base, with reports from the deep water patrols. 3 more ships this month tried to anchor over the old ritual site. Treasure hunters, mostly drawn by stories they don't understand. We guided them away without incident, but the pull is getting stronger. The lighthouse lens pulsed with Kane's concern as his consciousness focused on this disturbing development. Word of supernatural treasures in the Caribbean was spreading despite the Guardian Society's efforts to suppress such knowledge. Each new treasure hunting expedition brought the risk of someone stumbling onto artifacts or locations that could destabilize the delicate covenant. "We need to establish more lighthouses," Kane's voice resonated through the lens. "Coverage points throughout the region that can provide early warning of supernatural disturbances. The lens technology can be replicated, but each installation requires a guardian with sufficient transformation to interface with the equipment." Johannes Schmidt, whose own changes had given him the ability to sense supernatural emanations across vast distances, nodded thoughtfully. "I've identified 17 potential sites where the boundary between dimensions is thin enough to support lens installations, but we'll need recruits willing to undergo the kind of transformation necessary to operate them." The Guardian Society had grown slowly but steadily over the years, drawing members from those who had survived supernatural encounters in Caribbean waters. Pirates who had tangled with cursed artifacts, merchant sailors who had witnessed sea monsters, even colonial officials who had investigated unexplained phenomena, all were potential candidates if they possessed the mental flexibility to accept realities beyond conventional understanding. "The Leviathan has agreed to assist with controlled transformations," Kane announced through the lens, his words carrying the weight of cosmic authority. "Those who volunteer to become lighthouse guardians will be changed only as much as necessary to perform their duties." They can retain more of their humanity than I was able to preserve. As if summoned by their conversation about expansion, a ship appeared on the horizon, not the conventional merchant vessel or naval patrol they might have expected, but something that seemed to exist partially in their dimension and partially elsewhere. Its sails caught winds that blew from impossible directions, and its hull bore markings that predated any known maritime tradition. Visitors from the outer realms, Miguel identified, consulting charts that showed dimensional confluence points throughout the Caribbean. They come seeking audience with the Guardian of the Covenant. The lighthouse lens blazed with increased intensity as Kane's consciousness rose from the depths to meet these cosmic delegates. Through the crystal surface, his crew could see his transformed silhouette approaching the otherworldly vessel, no longer the pirate captain they had followed, but something greater, a bridge between worlds, a protector of balances that most humans couldn't even perceive. The work continues, Kane's voice echoed through the lens, as he prepared for negotiations that would shape the supernatural landscape of the Caribbean for decades to come. The new compass appeared in each surviving crew member's possession on the 10th anniversary of the Covenant's establishment, materializing overnight in their sleeping quarters as a gift from their transformed captain. Unlike ordinary navigation instruments that pointed toward magnetic north, these supernatural compasses always indicated the direction of Devil's Cay, ensuring that no matter how far their duties carried them across the Caribbean and beyond, they could always find their way home to the lighthouse that served as their spiritual anchor. Miguel Santos examined his compass in the pre-dawn light, filtering through his cabin window on the island of Martinique, where he had established the Guardian Society's primary recruitment and training center. The brass instrument hummed with familiar energy, its needle pointing steadily southeast toward the waters where Kane maintained his eternal vigil. But today the compass carried an additional message, a subtle vibration that indicated their captain was calling for a reunion. 10 years, Miguel murmured to himself, considering how much had changed since that fateful day, when Captain Thaddeus Kane had flipped a cursed turtle and unleashed forces that reshaped their understanding of reality itself. The frightened pirates who had once followed him in search of conventional treasure had become guardians of mysteries that protected two realms from mutual destruction. Tommy Hartwell received his compass's call while exploring the underwater cities that had grown around the Leviathan's domain, his dolphin-like form perfectly adapted for life in the spaces between air and water. The instrument's message reached him through harmonics that resonated with his transformed nervous system, drawing him toward a gathering that would commemorate their shared sacrifice and celebrate their unexpected triumph. Johannes Schmidt felt his compass pulse while investigating strange weather patterns near the Windward Passage, his Germanic precision now enhanced by supernatural senses that could detect dimensional disturbances days before they affected the physical realm. He abandoned his current mission without hesitation, understanding that Kane's summons took precedence over all other duties. One by one, the original crew members who had survived their captain's final voyage made their way back to Devil's Cay, traveling through waters that had been transformed by a decade of the Covenant's influence. The Caribbean was subtly different now. Storms followed more predictable patterns, sea monsters avoided shipping lanes, and the deep places offered sanctuary to those who approached them with proper respect. As they gathered around the lighthouse that had become their spiritual home, Kane's transformed presence manifested through the great lens with greater clarity than they had seen in years. His consciousness had evolved during the decade of his guardianship, becoming something that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions while retaining the essential humanity that made him their beloved captain. My faithful friends, Kane's voice resonated through the lens with warmth that transcended his supernatural transformation. 10 years ago, we thought we were hunting treasure. Instead, we discovered something far more valuable, the possibility of coexistence between forces that had been enemies since the dawn of time. The new compass in each crew member's hand pulsed with synchronized rhythm as Kane continued his address. These instruments represent more than navigation tools. They are symbols of the bonds that unite us across distances and transformations that would have driven ordinary men mad. No matter where your duties take you, No matter how much you change in service to the greater good, you will always be my crew." Miguel stepped forward, speaking for all of them. "Captain, the Guardian Society now includes over 200 members across 17 nations. The Lighthouse Network monitors supernatural activity from the Bahamas to the Spanish Main. But most importantly, the balance you established continues to hold. The Leviathan honors the covenant, and our world remains safe from cosmic forces it cannot comprehend." "And what of yourselves?" Kane asked, his concern for their well-being evident, despite the otherworldly harmonics in his voice. "Have you found peace in the lives you've built?" Tommy Hartwell's transformed features smiled with genuine contentment. "We've found purpose, Captain, better than any treasure we might have claimed in the old days." Johannes Schmidt nodded his agreement. "The work gives meaning to changes that could have been nothing but loss." As the sun set over Devil's Cay, painting the waters in shades of gold and crimson that reminded them of their first encounter with the supernatural, Kane's presence enveloped them with the same protective warmth he had provided during their most dangerous voyages. "Then our sacrifice was worth the price," he concluded, the lighthouse lens pulsing with benedictory light. "Sail safe, my friends. The sea watches over you, and I am always here when you need guidance home." The new compass in each guardian's hand glowed with inner light, carrying Kane's blessing across whatever waters they would navigate in the years to come.